Thank you very much, Kim. Today, I'm going to talk to you about not the 15th Air Force and not the 376 operations, because everyone in this room knows as much or more than I do about those. I'm going to talk to you about writing a book, how I went about it, how I got started, and that process. Maybe a little bit about operations, and if we have time, talk a little bit about, next slide, talk a little bit about a comparison between the Vietnam aviation experience, which I went through, and the World War II aviation experience, what my father went through. So on this slide, you see we're going to talk a little bit about background, research, writing and editing, underline editing, publishing, a little bit about the strategic bombing campaign, the 15th Air Force, combat airmen. Next slide. So let's talk about my background. Not much. I'm pretty well educated. I have a doctoral degree from Boston University. I taught at the university level and graded a lot of papers. I've done some academic writing. I've done a little bit of travelogue writing, but nothing that could be considered commercially viable. So my background is probably very similar to most of yours. I got started in the process of writing this book because of a stack of letters that my cousin passed on to me about 10 years ago, which her mother, my Aunt Alice, had rescued from my grandmother when she closed her house in New York. Now, if that doesn't confuse you, probably you're good for the rest of the presentation. These letters were from my father to his mother as he was going through training, and as mostly going through training, but some when he was overseas. I have to get my glasses on to read these cards. I read through the letters, and they were pretty surprising. At the time I was, 60 or 65 years old. I found out a lot about my father that I never knew. And of course, like many veterans from World War II, most veterans I would say, he never talked about his experience. He did talk about growing up a little bit. But I found reading these letters that he wrote to his mother, they were quite touching, very personal obviously, and very revealing as to what he was going through when he went through training. After reading this stack of letters, that was easily 3 or 4 inches tall, I thought, there's enough material here to start a book. Not necessarily to finish a book, but to start a book. After making that, coming to that conclusion, I put the letters in the drawer and let them sit there for another year. I got them out again, came to the same conclusion, and made a decision that I was going to try to write a book. A book primarily to share with my family, my father's grandchildren, and their grandchildren, the subsequent generations, as to what he did as a member of the greatest generation. I started doing a little bit of research. Obviously, I had a pretty good chronology of his time in training and a little bit of the chronology of his time overseas, which was from May to September 1944. I've always had an abiding interest in World War II, and primarily, I guess, because of my father. I don't know. I'm a baby boomer born in 1946, so that probably had a lot to do with it. Of course, in the library, there were scores of books about World War II and scores of books about the Allied bombing campaign in Europe. So I started reading many of them. I was fortunate in that I lived close to Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama, where all the records, that's a repository of all these records are for the Army Air Force in World War II. So I made a couple of trips down there, and I even found, believe it or not, a World War II, a B-24 pilot's manual at a garage sale in Nashville, Tennessee. And it looked like it had hardly been used. So I had all this. And then in 1997, I believe, my daughter was a junior or senior in high school, on the school paper, interested in journalism, and she interviewed my father. And I heard things in this interview, not that it was very long, that I had never heard growing up. And by this time I was, 50, 55 years old. So, of course, I had access to that. I also had my grandmother's recollections of my father growing up, so I was able to piece together some things when he was literally growing up before he went in the service and started writing letters to his mother. And then I came across a book by the son of a member of the 376, Ed Clendenin. He put together a mission history of the 376. Comprehensive, it's about this big. If you're interested in the 376, it's a must-have. It's an absolute must-have. It's probably the best chronology of any unit's missions I've ever seen in any war. So I highly recommend that. So after doing a little bit more research and pondering all of this stuff, I had a pretty good chronology from the time my dad was a baby, basically, until the time he completed his tour in the 376 in Italy. There was enough material to put together a coherent tale, memoir of his youth and World War II experience. My own experience as a helicopter pilot in Vietnam virtually assured that I could wing whatever I couldn't research. So there's some winging in the book. What I ended up with is a historical memoir of my dad's life from the time he was young through his World War II experience. Emphasis on the World War II experience, obviously. In terms of primary resources, I found an onion skin list prepared by his flight engineer, a guy by the name of Harvey Ulmer. I'm going to digress here. Harvey Ulmer was one of three brothers in the 15th Air Force flying in Italy at the same time. There was Harvey, Robert, and Arthur. Robert was shot down over northern Italy and lost. Arthur was captured in Yugoslavia, shot down, captured in Yugoslavia for about 6 or 7 months, eventually was repatriated. So there are three brothers all fighting in the same theater, in the same, not the same bomb groups obviously, but the same Air Force in Italy at the same time. You talk about sacrifice. Harvey put together this type. It had been yellowed and was very fragile by the time I came across in my parents' filing cabinet when I closed up their house in 2002. It contained the date, mission number by Harvey's count, and we'll talk about counting missions and that sort of thing a little bit later. The location, a brief summary of what transpired on the mission, the aircraft number, and the time flown. Harvey Ulmer was not only my father's flight engineer, but he was what they call a check engineer. So he would fly with other crews to check out their flight engineers. So some of these missions on Harvey's list, I suspect, came from some of those other missions he flew as a check engineer. I have no way of verifying that. But because his list didn't agree with my father's list, which I'll talk about in a minute, and didn't agree with Ed's list, there's a dichotomy in the numbers and consecutive missions of my father's crew. To overcome all these differences, I decided to go with Ed Clendenin's book and use the missions and the mission numbers that he had researched at the Air War College. So I told you a little bit about the Ulmer brothers, and I'm in contact with Harvey Ulmer's family, and I think there's a ton of material for a book in the story of those three brothers. Whether I ever get around to it or not, I don't know. So in addition to Harvey's handwritten mission statement, I found another onion skin that my dad prepared. It was much more brief, much shorter, and it was torn and missing the last 8 missions. And it was only 1 page long. Harvey's list was probably 5 or 6 pages long. On my dad's list, which didn't necessarily agree with all the missions on Harvey's list, it just contained the date, the mission number by my father's count, the destination, and the flight time logged. I found my father's original logbook, which most of you understand records the date, the aircraft type, the specific aircraft number, the destination, and time flown. And aircraft logbooks are held in such high esteem that they're considered legal documents. However, that doesn't necessarily guarantee their accuracy, because again, I looked at my father's logbook, I looked at his list of missions, I looked at Harvey Ulmer's list of missions, and there were some differences. Of course, I had my father's letter to his mother, and I made a trip to Italy, to San Pancrazio, Italy, to try and find some people who were around at the time. And believe it or not, I found 2 women, one of whose family owned the farm where they built the airfield at San Pancrazio, and the buildings had been requisitioned by the Army Air Force from her parents. She's told me that they were the Army Air Force were the best tenants her family ever had. They fixed up all the buildings, they painted them, they made them like new. So they were very happy. I will tell you one thing, that when I was in San Pancrazio, and I get a little emotional when I say this, the airfield is still there, it's fenced, you really can't get in it, but I found a way to get in there, actually stand on the runway. And it was a thrill for me to stand on that runway where so many young guys during World War II took off, some came back, some didn't. It was a Zen moment for me, and I'll tell you, I never felt closer to my father than I did on that day in January of 2015 in San Pancrazio, Italy. So, as I indicated earlier, it quickly became evident to me that the primary source documents were not always in agreement, even on the most important aspects of where they went, what the mission was. But the 2 most authoritative sources were my dad's logbook and Ed Clendenden's mission history. So if there was a disagreement between those 2, I went with Ed's book. Just for consistency, at any rate. However, I was in the Army. I spent 22 months flying in Vietnam. I know how we keep records, how the military keeps records in the crucible of combat. So even the records at Maxwell Air Force Base, although they're the most authoritative, I wouldn't bet my life on them, because I know how we kept records in Vietnam. Next slide. So once you've got your primary resources and you've got secondary resources, books, library materials, etc., then you got to decide how you're going to start. And you can start really in a number of ways, but 2 primary ways. You can start with the stream of consciousness, just start writing, which is what I did, because I'm a kind of a talker, and I enjoy writing, so I just started writing, and I organized it later. Or you can do an outline. Start at the beginning and outline it just like you did when you were doing book reports in school. If you don't know how to use a computer, you're in trouble writing a book, as far as I'm concerned. Writing a book longhand and trying to reorganize things, particularly if you go the stream of consciousness route, is very, very difficult. So I could not have done it myself without a computer. But I got in early, in the 80s with personal computers, and I'm computer literate, so that was the easiest way for me to go. So this slide here is really more questions than actual information. So you got to make these decisions for yourself. The time aspect of writing a book should not be underestimated. And the dedication of your time should not be underestimated. If you can't, it's very difficult to write, go away from it for a couple of weeks, and then try to come back, because you find yourself rethinking and even rewriting what you did the last time you were with it. So you need to do it every single day. You don't need to spend hours every single day, although those long sessions when you can spend 2 or 3 or 4 hours writing, I found were the most productive for me, because I could get a lot in chronologically and not have to go back and rethink it. But even if you can just take out your phone on a day when you're busy and make some notes and sorts of things that you want to look into, you need to do that. You need to stay with it every day. You need to be dedicated. Otherwise, it will never get done. I would venture to say, this is a rhetorical question now. Don't answer. I would venture to say that there are a lot of people in this room that have started writing a book of some sort, a narrative, a monograph, and they've been at it for a long, long time, longer than they should have. And again, I say, you have to dedicate yourself, you have to do something every single day. It took me, the book about my dad is 150 pages, more or less, and it took me over a year to write it. That's before anybody read it, before any editing, and that's writing pretty religiously every single day. Now, I'm not as bright as a lot of people, so some of you could probably write a lot quicker than that, but that's what it took me. Once I had the first draft, I gave it to somebody else to read. A couple of friends who were, I would say, at least familiar with military history and military aviation, just to see if it was worth reading, and also to see if there was any wider interest. If it meant something to them, then I thought, well, maybe there is wider interest. So I gave it to these trusted agents, unedited, including my wife, by the way, who's my biggest supporter, as well as critic. The people that had a background in military history and aviation told me they thought that it had a wider interest. So from there, I thought, well, I need to get an editor. And I edited my own book, which was a dumb idea. You can't do that effectively. I had my wife look at it, who was a stickler for particularly grammar. She's not a subject matter expert. And I had a couple of other guys, friends of mine, look at it and edit it. Then I actually hired a professional editor. And guess what? She found a lot of stuff in the book that needed correcting. The book was virtually unpublishable before I got to a professional editor. And not that all of my trusted agents or me were that lacking in writing skill, but editing a book is a specialized skill, and if you want a product that's mistake-free, you get a professional editor. It's just that simple. It's not easy, and it's painful. When you're on a phone with your editor for 3 or 4 hours, and she's telling you how wrong this is, and this is, and this is, that, sort of hurts your ego a little bit. But I've written 2 books now, and I found that it's essential to find a professional editor, a book editor. I indicated that I was in academia for a while, so I knew a couple of ladies. Well, I knew one lady who did it for a living after she retired from the university, and I hired her the first time. When I went to write the second book, she had retired completely from book editing, but she had a friend who lives in Wamega, Kansas, who is a book editor. So she was able to refer me to her, and she did a great, both of my editors did a great job. Now, getting your book edited, if you have a potential bestseller and you have a publisher right off the bat, they're going to assign a literary agent to you, and they're going to find you a good editor and take care of all this for you. Well, I didn't have a potential bestseller, and Rand McNally, Penguin, none of those people were knocking at my door. So I had to find my own editor, and I did, as I indicated before. But editing is not inexpensive. That's the most expensive front money that I put into this book. You know, each book costs, I think the first book cost about $1,800 to edit, and the second book, which was a little longer, and the editor was probably a little bit less efficient, still very good, but it took her longer, cost about $2,500 to have the book edited. But if you want a book that's mistake-free, you get yourself a professional editor. And like I said, it can be painful. In a meeting with your editor, she's telling you, he or she is telling you how poorly you write. My initial thoughts on the book was to do with, you know, Staples Office Depot Publishing. And that is, you know, get the book edited, take it down there, have it printed, spiral bound, and give it to my family. Once I was convinced by my trusted agents that had read the book that it had wider appeal, I decided to take the path of least resistance and self-publish the book. Now, how many people know what self-publishing is? Well, self-publishing is I guess it can be a lot of things, but there are many, many companies now who will publish your book, provide you with all kinds of support, cover design, copyright, getting the ISBN number, all that stuff, editing, etc. But you pay for that. You front the money. So I thought, well, I'll take the path of least resistance, and I hired a self-publishing company, a pretty well-known, one of the top 5 according to the ratings that I read. And I lacked experience, obviously, in publishing and that sort of thing. So, again, I wanted to I had a good draft. I had been edited. I wanted to get it out the door. So, basically, self-publishing means you accept the front-end burden of the cost. And I think I paid this company, I want to say, $1,400, $1,500. They were going to do the cover. They were going to do all these other things for me. But what I found out in the process of working with them is I thought they were going to be working for me. I ended up working for them. They had a problem, and it's a legitimate problem, with the use of photographs, diagrams, etc. Now, I come from a family of lawyers. I had 4 lawyers tell me that you can use official Air Force photographs in your book without specific permission. You can use a Google map in your book without specific permission. They were telling me I couldn't do that. So I went through a process with them where I took every illustration. It was like a university project, and I documented where that came from and why it could be used. I sent that to my brother-in-law, who's a lawyer, who's familiar with copyright law. He said, make a few changes, which I did. I then sent it to my self-publishing company. They would not accept it. Well, for me, that was kind of the last straw. I said, I'm not working for you anymore. We came to an impasse, and I'm not saying it was not legitimate. They have their rules, and they're a sizable company, and they have to protect themselves. But I had my own attorneys advising me that this is perfectly legitimate. So at that impasse, I said, okay, we're finished. I want a refund. Well, I got about half my money back, which I thought was okay. But in the meantime, it took 5 or 6 months to get to this point, which was wasted time. They had not done anything else except argue with me about the use of certain photographs or diagrams. The 15th Air Force diagram, which you'll see later, is a diagram done by a guy who lived in New York, was deceased, I found out. I went to his family. I got their permission. It was about a third order family member to use that diagram, and that was not acceptable to the self-publishing company, things like that. So those are the kinds of impasses we came to. Once I fired the self-publishing company, there I was again 5 or 6 months later, no progress, with an edited draft ready to go. So I decided that I would look for a real publisher. And that took, probably a couple of months. I found Miriam Publishing in Bennington, Vermont, who specialize in publishing World War II military books. The guy who owns the company, Ray Miriam, has been in business for over 30 years, really knows what he's doing, and small operation, and we came to an agreement. And so Ray agreed that he would publish the book. Very competent guy, and working with him was like completely the opposite of working with a self-publishing company. He knew what he was doing. The only thing he didn't understand is he didn't know that I didn't know what I was doing. So I was always asking him questions, and most of the time he was way ahead of me. He had already started or already had the answers to the questions. There was one other problem with Ray. At this time, I guess it was 2016, 2015, he was 65 years old and decided to get married for the first time. So right in the middle of my book. So that would cause a 2-month delay, which is kind of hard to begrudge the guy, Anyway, that caused a 2 months. But if you subtract the marriage delay, it took him 4 months from the time he got the edited manuscript to get the book published and out the door to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Lulu Press, etc. So he designed the cover, and what else did he do? What he didn't do and what he doesn't do is market the book. He's got a website, and that's the limit of his marketing. So I had to decide how I was going to market the book, which not exactly my strong suit. I decided that I would come to a reunion, try and expose the book there, place it in local bookstores, had a couple of presentations. I lived in Nashville at the time, had a couple of presentations in local bookstores, went to the library, church meetings, spoke, Rotary Club meetings, wherever I could about the book, locally. Also went to a couple of veterans organizations in Alabama that I have some contact with. And that was really the extent of my marketing the book. But since I originally intended to do the book for my family, I figured anything I sell is gravy. And at this point, I'm a little over 2,000 books. So if that gives you any idea of what you're looking at here. It costs around $3,000 basically to have the book edited and get, I had to have several copies of the drafts produced, printed at Staples and sent out to my friends to read and that sort of thing. By the time I was in, some of the marketing expenses, getting things printed, postcards and that sort of thing, I probably had about $3,000 in the first book and maybe a little bit more in the second book. So my advice to you, if I can provide you any, if I can be so bold as to try and provide you some, is decide early what you want to do with the book. Is it strictly for family? You're going to do a self-publish? You're going to try to find a publisher? And that sort of thing. And that should sort of guide what you do and when you do it. Think carefully about a marketing plan if you want to sell the book. Unlike me, think carefully about it It was an afterthought as far as I was concerned. I mean, I'm happy that we sold a couple of thousand books, great, and I attribute that primarily to the reviews that it got on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, because that's probably the best marketing you could get. If you can afford it, and if your book is a potential bestseller, get an agent. You know, because a publishing agent can do all of these things that, including marketing, that I had to do. If the work's good enough to be commercially viable, get an agent. So any questions about the book, about writing a book? Yes, sir.
Did you send a copy to the self-publishing outfit?
Absolutely.
That's the right thing to do.
Anything else? Yes, sir.
What format, when you were shopping for publishers, what's that process? First, I assume there's some publishers that say, please don't send us anything. Did you initially send a little one page and get permission to submit a complete manuscript?
No, self-publishers are not that discriminatory because you're fronting the money.
But I was talking that next step where you sought a, quote, real publisher.
Oh yeah, I had to send him I had to send him a draft of the book, and I told him what the book was about. He says, "Well, send me a draft," and so I went down to Staples, had it copied, spiral bound, and sent it to Merriam Press.
But you didn't have to initially do a letter getting permission to send a manuscript.
No. He's not that big of an operator.
Oh, okay.
You know, he probably publishes a dozen books a year, similar to my book. You know. Yes, sir.
Did you include citations and index and all that kind of stuff?
Well, I did include a works cited section in the back of the book, which tells you all the documents that I referred to. I did not footnote the book. That's not normally done when you write a memoir. So in academe, we use the American Psychological Association writing style, which doesn't call for footnotes necessarily. You can use footnotes, but normally it doesn't call for footnotes, but it calls for specific citations within the text that refer to the works cited page. But according to my editors, we don't do that when we're just writing books. Yes, sir.
So when you went with the Merriams after the self-publishing, did he have any problem at all with your photographs or your diagrams or anything?
No, absolutely none.
Did he have his own lawyer to check that out too?
I have no idea. He's been in business for 30 years, so I'm assuming that he's not going to accept any risk like that. But what he did is he captioned all the photographs, author supplied. And remember, I had done this huge work for the self-publisher that listed every photograph, where it came from, and why it was usable. So, and my lawyer said that worked with his changes.
One other format in the manuscript you submitted, were those pictures and diagrams inserted into the text or in a separate section?
Inserted into the text. It can be done both ways, but I felt like it was important for my family, really, as I was talking about something, to see a photograph of it, to see San Pancrazio, the old farm building. Today, which I took that picture myself in 2015, what was used back in 1944.
What's the title of
Liberando, Reflections of a Reluctant Warrior, which my father was a reluctant warrior. He was a lot different than me. Yes, sir.
John, how did you decide on the price point for the book?
I didn't decide that. The publisher decided that. Yes, ma'am.
How much did you have to, when you went with Merriam, how much did you have to pay him to?
Nothing. He's a real publisher. He's not a self-publisher.
Okay, so that's the difference.
So he gets a cut. Every book that's sold, he gets a cut, which is standard. That's how they make money.
And with self-publishing, you pay to print so many copies? And
They still get a cut of the book, not as much. Now, when you, that's an interesting thing that you just said, ma'am, because now in the modern era, we have what's called print on demand. So, for example, I had just about run out of the books before the conference. I was moving from Nashville to Topeka. It was a mess. But I needed some more books. So I called my publisher, Ray, and I said, Ray, I need, X number of copies of the book. He called Lulu Press, who is a different printer than we had originally. But Lulu Press, and they printed 15 copies and sent them to my new address in Topeka. So they print, there's no storing copies of books in your garage anymore. When you need some books, I call the publisher, send them a check, and they send the books directly to me. So that makes it much more efficient than, a run of 1,000 copies or that kind of nonsense. Yes, sir.
Congratulations on getting your work published. Snoopy is quite famous, and he kept getting rejections. I just wanted to congratulate you.
Thank you. I felt pretty good about it myself, to be honest with you. Yes, ma'am.
Hold the book up, show us what it looks like.
I'm gonna sit out at the table where Steve was after this, and if you're interested, you can buy a copy. Or you can go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble. They're on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. Yeah, Ray Merriam designed the cover. Picture of my father's logbook page in the back. Any other questions about writing a book?
I have a question. How much is the book if I buy it?
$15.
Thank you.
$14.95.
Very good.
Yes, ma'am.
When you did some research at Maxwell Air Force Base
Yes.
in Alabama, do you know what the difference is between what they have at Maxwell and, let's say, in Baltimore or Maryland with that archives?
The Army Air Force archives are at Maxwell Air Force Base in the library. I don't know what they have in Baltimore. Now, the National Archives are in Washington and Baltimore, and that may be, that's where all the presidential papers are supposed to be. Some are in West Palm Beach, but most of them are supposed to be in the archives. But apparently, honestly, I don't know what's in Baltimore. But if you want to research the Army Air Force and their operations, Maxwell Air Force Base.
You mentioned some archives way at the first of your speech. I think in Alabama.
Yes.
Where was that?
That's at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. And all you have to do is write to the librarian, and it's not always easy to get on an Air Force base, like you found out yesterday. Right. Those of you, if you write to the librarian, they'll give you permission. It's not hard.
And do you actually book a time to go?
Well, if you want help, that's a good idea. And I needed help, so I booked it. But I was an instructor at the Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. So I understand how military libraries work. So I was a little bit ahead of the game there.
And how accessible is the material, or is it like the final shot in Indiana Jones of just endless boxes?
No, if you make an appointment and get one of the research librarians to work with you, it's very accessible. If you go there by yourself, you're going to spend hours. But they're way smarter than we are, the librarians. Yes.
I don't know if everybody's aware of this, but the person that wrote the mission history is back in the...
I see him.
He's had a lot of experience with dealing with Maxwell and publishing books too, so I knew you probably knew him, but he could answer those Maxwell questions.
Ed, go ahead.
I was going to comment that the Maxwell records are accessible through the agency called the Air Force Historical Research Agency, and they have an excellent website.
and you can type in the 376 boxes, and it'll tell you all the microfilm reels that reference the 376. So you can type in any keyword that you want, and it'll give you those. Then you can send an email to this, like you said, the librarians who will then get in contact with you about actually buying. I think they're now on CDs now. Are they not on CDs yet?
It's sent by email and free.
Okay. In my day and age, you actually bought the microfilm. But anyway, so I have reels, I have like 60 reels of microfilm. I think it's going to be only migrated to CD. Chuck over there's also got experience.
Yeah, this is a comment, I'll make 2 comments. The National Archives and College Park has, and I know there's 6,005 boxes of mission records for the Army Air Force of World War II. So they have a very extensive collection that you can use. You have to make an appointment, that's the code. You can go in, tell them what boxes you want, and they'll be waiting for you when you arrive. Ed is right about the microfilm, although you can now, you order up to 10 reels of microfilm at a time from Maxwell, and it is now free. So you just send in a request form, they put it together, email it to you, and you download it. I have over 500 reels. It didn't cost me a penny.
So for those of you that didn't hear me earlier, Ed is the guy that wrote the mission history of the 376, which is the source for the 376, period. So Ed, stand up so everybody can see you.
It took me 15 years to do that. So when John says you've got a lot of time, you invest a lot of time. And a lot of dead end.
Yes, sir.
So, what's the difference between the archives we're talking about and the personnel records at the St. Louis archives that where all of the armed forces records are, and that's the one that burned in 73 or 72 and destroyed a lot of the records?
Well, I think that those records in St. Louis are personnel records, not the operational records. Yeah.
The operations are at Maxwell, personnel is in St. Louis.
Okay.
Or used to be in St. Louis, as the case may be. Yes, Kim?
Okay, this project started out being for your family.
Correct.
What was the response?
From my family? They loved it. They loved it. My parents had 5 children. Each of those children had several children, so there's lots of grandchildren, who some of whom knew my father and some of whom didn't really know my father, but now they all know my dad through this book. And that was the purpose of this book. In the process of doing the book, I put together an archive, which includes Ed's book and other books and drafts and photographs that were used, and it filled a couple of big tubs. And I thought to myself, well, I got the book written, and oh, by the way, I'm moving from Nashville to Topeka, and I don't want to have to move any more than I absolutely have to, so I had to decide what to do with the archive for the book. So what I did is I got one of my lawyer nephews, one of my father's grandchildren, and he took the tubs, and now he's in charge of the tubs, and he'll pass them on to the subsequent generations. But when you're doing work like this, you accumulate a lot of stuff, and it really comes home to roost. Like I said, 3 weeks ago when we literally moved, or really it was longer ago than that when we started planning moving, I planned on not taking a lot of stuff, including the archive, but I wanted to keep it safe for subsequent generations. So if we're finished talking about that, let's talk a little bit about, go to the next. So all of you know more about this than I do, so please bear with me if I'm trying to teach you how to suck eggs here. That's a picture of Italy down at the bottom, center of that picture, and those are arcs of the areas that they went out and bombed. Those areas were not reachable by the bombers from England. That was the reason for the creation of the 15th Air Force. And everybody knows that at the beginning of the strategic bombing campaign, when it was only coming from England, the Americans and the British decided to divide up the responsibilities. The British, who had been attacked repeatedly, not only the military-industrial complex, but their cities by the Germans, decided that they were interested in area bombing. They had no compunction about civilian casualties because they had been receiving casualties from the Germans at night, which was, night flying was actually safer, at least in terms of enemy activity. The Americans believed that precision bombing was the way to go, and the agreeable consequences of fewer civilian casualties and less collateral damage sort of fit in with that concept. So the Americans decided that they would do daylight precision bombing. As I said before, the 8th Air Force couldn't reach Southern Europe, which is where most of the German oil facilities were. And so that was the reason that the 15th Air Force was created. Of course, the genesis of the 15th Air Force was in Libya. And you all know the history of Halpro and the first raid on Palesti and all that, which I won't go into. And then once southern Italy was secured, they were able to establish all these bases in Italy. One of the things that I discovered when I went to San Pancrazio in 2015 was the airfield there, of course, was built for all intents and purposes by the U.S. Army Air Force. But there was an airfield there before that was built by the Germans, according to the local people. And that ended up being the extension of the runway that the Army Air Force has built. And I didn't find that in any of the history books anywhere. I had to go talk to people locally. So these bases were spread all over Italy, 200 miles from Lecce all the way up to Ramitelli on the west coast for the 15th Air Force, dozens of them. When the 15th was formed, it originally had 30,000 men, 900 plus bombers, and hundreds of fighters, including the famous Red Tails, by the way. Go to the next slide. So you can't read this, I don't expect you to, but this shows you the complexity and the intensity of the operations of the 15th Air Force. It was a big unit, a huge unit. This is a slide that was created by a gentleman who was deceased, and one of the big points of contention with the self-publisher that I tried to go with. The point here is that it was a big operation, and when it was deactivated in 1945, the 15th had grown to 80,000 men, 6,858 aircraft, and over the 18 months the 15th Air Force existed, 5,000 aircraft were lost. 2,000 of these were bombers with their crew of 10. So they were fighters, the 15th was, and they don't get the credit that they deserve. Books have been written about the forgotten 15th, which you've probably all read. But they weren't first. The 8th Air Force out of England was first, so they seemed to get all the publicity. The 15th had really 4 specific missions. Destroy the oil refineries at Palesti, destroy the BMW aircraft engine manufacturing plant in Regensburg, destroy the fighter manufacturing complex at Wiener Neustadt in Austria, and destroy the synthetic oil facilities in southern Poland. In between, there were many other missions. For example, the D-Day landing, the 15th was not there, but they siphoned off a lot of German aircraft support into the 15th area. So in a way, they supported the D-Day operation quite extensively, really. They prepared for and directly supported Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France. And of course, every day they flew missions in direct support of the Italian ground campaign in Italy. In terms of results, it took a year to destroy the oil facilities in Ploesti. Finally, in August 1944, it was determined to be destroyed. And that was after a year of sustained bombing. The aircraft engine complex in Regensburg and the aircraft manufacturing complex in Wiener Neustadt were never really destroyed. They went underground. And what happened toward the end of the war was not that Germans couldn't produce engines and aircraft, they couldn't produce the pilots to fly them. So while their production was never halted in terms of hardware, in terms of the human element, they couldn't keep up. And of course, they didn't have any fuel anymore because we had destroyed Ploesti. One of the interesting things I came across was, of course, everybody in the Army Air Corps was a volunteer, and they were all male at the time. Combat airmen were considered bomber crew or fighter pilots. That's how the U.S. Army Air Force classified them. Combat air crewmen flew bombers or fighters. The guys who flew C-47s on D-Day, the guys who flew L-4s for artillery adjustment, they were not considered combat air crewmen. Now, probably a lot of those guys could come up with an argument on that, but that's just the way it was. The only rationale I have for this is that danger was the exception for a C-47 pilot. For a bomber crewman, it was the rule. It was an exception to go on a milk run. So at any rate, the military does strange things, and that's what they did. Pilots, bombardiers, and navigators had to be between the ages of 18 and 27. All combat air crewmen were in the top two categories of the Army Air Corps. It was really the military testing program. They came from all points of the, you all know that. I'm going to sort of go into a comparison now of what it was like in Vietnam compared to what it was like in Italy in World War II. Yes, ma'am.
Before you go on, can you say a little bit more about what they did on D-Day?
They siphoned off air assets from the Germans that could have been used to fight against the Allied landing in France because they needed them to protect the aircraft factory, the oil facilities, et cetera. So it doesn't sound like much, but it was a big deal. It was a big deal. The Germans would have been in a lot better shape had they not had the 15th Air Force to cope with too in Italy and Romania and Yugoslavia. Yes, ma'am.
I'm wanting to hear more about your dad. Is that coming?
No. But it's in. What do you want to know? I mean, I'm very happy to talk about it, but.
No, that's okay. I thought if you had it in your notes.
His missions.
My dad flew 50 missions. He was in Italy from May of 44. They finished their 50 missions in September. I don't think he left until October. A couple of interesting stories. When he left for overseas with his airplane and his crew, he left from Forbes Field, 5 miles away. In 1993, I lived in Leavenworth, Kansas. My mother and father came to see me, and we were looking for things to do. So I said, well, there's this air museum over in Topeka. Why don't we go over there? My father was a lifelong aviator, airline pilot, bomber pilot, et cetera. So he was game for that. We got to Forbes Field, and he looks around and says, this is where I left for World War II, from this base right here. So, interesting. He was born in the 20s. He grew up fascinated by Charles Lindbergh and flying, built model airplanes, did all that. came from a lower middle class family in New York, and he didn't go to college, really wasn't going anywhere until the war started heating up, and they came up with the aviation cadet program, which was a program, there were several names for it, so excuse me if I haven't used the right name, but it was a program that the Army Air Forces established at colleges to get students in college through their private pilot license. He didn't go to college until they came up with the aviation cadet training program. Then he decided to go to college so he could get flight training because he had always been interested in airplanes. At the time, he was moving beer barrels from the docks down at Newburgh, New York, up to the taverns, working for somebody, obviously. So he went to college, stayed in college long enough to get, and I'm not sure, don't remember whether it was a semester or two, just to get his private pilot's license. Once he got that, then he signed up for the Army Air Corps. And at the time, there was a bit of a wait. They couldn't train as many people as they had backed up in the system. So he went back to hauling beer barrels into taverns and, you know, that sort of thing, and finally got called up. He trained all over the South, and finally he went to multi-engine training in Illinois. And then my dad never went to B-24 transition school. He was assigned to a unit in Utah, or Idaho, not Utah, and they expected a guy to come already transitioned into the B-24. And his commander says, well, we don't do that. You're going to have to fly in a jump seat and learn how to fly this airplane. And I'll send you up with an instructor pilot and another crew member and a co-pilot. They just didn't have a slot for him. So he basically got trained in the B-24 on the fly. He had some aptitude, so he did it. And then they did their mission training. Then he was put in a unit. They did their mission training also in Idaho. And then it was go overseas. So they came, he and my mother got married in Idaho. And they came to Forbes Field, were finally assigned an airplane, you know, after a month or so. And my mother went back to New York, and he and his crew went from here to West Palm Beach, Florida, to Brazil, to Africa, and then to Italy. And he had a navigator by the name of Frank Belasco, who was a college graduate from California, engineer, so I don't know, was an aircraft engineer, civil engineer, very highly educated guy. He was a great navigator, and he was so good that my father was always afraid that somebody would steal him and, you know, put him in the commander's crew or something. And frequently he did fly with other crews, but he was a great guy, and I'm in touch with his daughters. And anyway, so that's kind of his story. And Dad flew his 50 missions. They've, you know, got the, excuse the term, shit shot out of them a lot of times. Only went down once, and went down in Natuno. And it wasn't because they were shot up. It was because the co-pilot didn't put enough fuel on the airplane. So they had a forced landing in Natuno. When they landed the airplane, a couple of the engines had already stopped, and once the airplane got on the ground, the other engine stopped, and it was embarrassing to have to be towed in to the ramp because they were out of gas. But he was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for some of the actions he was involved in, and the only crew member that they lost was a guy by the name of Bunker, who was a gunner, and when they first got to Italy, he was sick and missed a couple of their missions. So the whole time they were working toward 50 missions, Bunker was working on 2 less because he was sick. So he wanted to go home with his crew at the same time they did, so he asked if he could fly with another crew to get up to the same count as the rest of his assigned crew. So the flight engineer, Harvey Ulmer, and my dad talked about it, and they said, yeah, well, we can do that. He was lost on takeoff in another airplane. Tragic. But that's the only crew member from my dad's crew that was wounded or lost. So that's kind of the story. And the rest is in the book. Pardon me?
Did the tail gunner on that boat?
The tail gunner made it. He's the only one of the crew that crashed on takeoff that made it out. I don't know. But that's in the book. That's in the book. But you know, once that B-24 was not a real sturdy airplane, and not unlike the B-17. So if you mishandled it, or if you mishandled it, it could be very unforgiving. So go to the next slide. That's a picture of my dad in his tent in San Pancrazio. Next slide. That's a picture of my dad and his crew, cover of the book. Next slide. So this is just a little comparison of what it was like in Vietnam as a combat air crewman, which was my experience, and what it was like in World War II. So the first thing I want to say, in the summer in southern Italy, in Vietnam, the climate's very similar. Both malarial, both hot, both seriously affecting aircraft performance. So from that standpoint, during the summer, they were pretty much the same. So we talked malaria. Malaria was prevalent in Vietnam, prevalent in southern Italy. You had to take malaria tablets. Anybody here ever had to take malaria tablets? What did it do to your constitution? Yeah, for a couple of days after you took the tablet, you know, you were kind of friendly with the bathroom. Hot, high density altitude. Density altitude has a tremendous impact, and that is the amount of moisture in the air, has a tremendous effect on aircraft performance, whether it's a B-24, a B-17, or a UH-1 Huey, which is what I flew mostly. With the B-24, they were overloaded all the time in relation to the density altitude. So I know of 10,000 pounds. With a B-24, when you're going down the runway, there are a couple of speeds that you're concerned with. V1, which is a speed beyond which you cannot stop. V2 is the rotational speed. And then you have a speed that gives you the ability to climb, I forget what the V number is called, if you lose an engine. Lift. But there's a V number. Anyway, with the B-24, when you pass V1, you weren't stopping. There's no way you could stop. So if you didn't get off the ground, you crashed, like this incident we talked about. And I know many of you have heard stories about scraping the bottom of the airplane with the olive groves getting off the ground in Italy. With a helicopter, if you weren't getting off the ground, you just stopped, kick somebody off, and try it again. So while the aircraft performance degradation was very similar, with a helicopter it was a lot easier because you can always stop the thing. Kim's brother and I were talking earlier about what we called a running takeoff. Helicopters in Vietnam were so heavy, there was no lifting up to a hover and then taking off. You had to literally drive it along the runway until you hit what we call translational lift, and you got enough forward airspeed to add to the advancing blade, which is the blade that's actually creating the lift, to get the aircraft off the ground. Gunships were infamous for that. They were fully loaded. You just couldn't start throwing rockets off. So it was not unusual to see them driving along the runway like a fixed-wing airplane trying to get off the ground. Living conditions, same. Requisition buildings, some temporary frame buildings, and tents. That's exactly what we had in Vietnam. Security. In Italy, there were some of the units in the 15th Air Force that had security because of potential terrorist sabotage activities. San Pancrazio wasn't one of them, but some of the Italy's north, up and north toward Ramitelli, had units consisting of what they called colored troops at the time, black soldiers, provided all the security. They were completely segregated and had no contact with the normal units, except walking down the flight line, you know, one of the security guys might say, well, who supported you yesterday? And of course you weren't supposed to tell them that, but they knew. They had a grapevine, they had their own grapevine, and they knew that, and they were particularly proud. For example, if the Red Tails had supported the 376 the day before, they would have known that, and they would have asked and that sort of thing. But as I said, at San Pancrazio, at the time my dad was there, they didn't have security, but they did in the north. Talk a little bit about comparing missions. Obviously, the mission of the 15th Air Force was strategic bombing, and everything they did, whether it was reconnaissance or fighters, was to support the strategic bombing campaign. In 1947, on this day, President Truman separated the Army Air Force from the Army. The Air Force maintained its strategic missions, and the Army retained aviation and focused more on the operational level or the tactical level with helicopters. Still, and primarily direct support for the ground troops. Many of you don't know this, but Air Force guys really like to fight other airplanes. They don't much like to support the ground troops if they have a choice. That's changed a lot in the last 20 years, but that's why the Army developed their own attack capabilities with the Apache and that sort of thing. And that's the Army's mission, direct support of the ground troops. We don't care about the strategic mission. We don't care about bombing, although there are some exceptions. For example, in the first Iraq War, Saddam Hussein and his army had massive anti-aircraft facilities all over the country. And to set foot within their range at any altitude was a death sentence. So before they kicked off the bombing of Iraq, they sent Army Apaches, low level, 10 feet off the ground, to these facilities, these anti-aircraft facilities, to take them out. They took them out in a wide swath to Baghdad. So these Air Force guys could fly these fighters up and down this area that they had cleared. So that was the kind of almost a strategic use of Army aviation, which we don't much get into. But that's the Air Force's job, strategic aviation. Army is direct support of the ground troops. Flying times. How many people in here have flown a mission for the 15th Air Force in Italy? How long were those missions? Same thing in Vietnam. We flew 6, 8, 10 hours. My longest flying day in Vietnam was 10 and a half hours. And that's without shutting the airplane down. Now, in the 15th Air Force, you took off once, and hopefully you landed once. My 10 and a half hours were taking off, landing, taking off, landing, taking off, landing, refueling, taking off, landing, never shutting the airplane down. We did hot refueling with the airplane running. So, but the flying days were very, very similar. The enemy profile, we fought a determined, fanatical enemy in Vietnam, and the guys in the 15th Air Force fought a determined, fanatical enemy in Europe. The difference was The Germans had an industrial base, and they could supply themselves. In Vietnam, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were completely dependent on their allies to provide the wherewithal to wage war. So there's a big difference there, and that contributed a lot to the danger factor, if you will. You know, in Vietnam, I would say we had it easy compared to the guys in the 15th Air Force, because we mentioned earlier, it was routine to be shot at and get hit with flak on a mission in the 15th Air Force. It was maybe a once-a-week deal in Vietnam to get shot at and hit. But, you know, there's nothing more exhilarating to be shot at and missed. Anyway, in Europe, 15th Air Force was concerned with flak, which indirect fire, shells that exploded at altitude, and if you were flying through it, you got hit. In Vietnam, we were concerned with ground fire and direct fire anti-aircraft weapons, 50 caliber, 21 caliber type weapons. So the danger factor in the 15th Air Force was really far greater than what I experienced in Vietnam, what most helicopter pilots experienced in Vietnam. Aircrew profile, all volunteers, both wars, same ages, 18 to 24, most of the guys. What else can I say about that? Education, again, Vietnam, mostly high school graduate. I was a high school graduate at the time. I had gone to college, but I was a miserable failure. So I got drafted. Anyway, so my conclusions is when you look at both experiences, and you know, I couldn't help but do that because I had the Vietnam experience and I wrote the book about my dad's World War II experience. They were a lot more alike than different. A lot more alike than different. So that concludes my presentation. If you're interested in the book or books, I'm going to sit out at Steve's table for a little while and you can pick one up, or they're available in Barnes & Noble, Amazon, whatever. Any questions?
If I may, sir, there's one small correction to what you said about close air support. We had 3 full wings stationed in Cam Bay, Ubon, and New Dorn, who had 2 missions, close air support with the F4 and Big Cap. So close air support by the United States Air Force during Vietnam was very active. I flew with a guy in MD-111 later who got a Silver Star that he was put in for by the Army for a close air support mission at night. Thank you.
Okay, well that sort of completes my presentation.